Hello and welcome to G Fun Facts Online. Today we're diving deep into the heart of Florida, but we're not talking about theme parks. We're talking about the state's crystal clear soul, its network of over 1,000 natural springs. These aren't just swimming holes. They are geological marvels, often called bowls of liquid light. For generations, they've been sanctuaries from the heat and havens for unique wildlife. But that idyllic picture is fading. A slow, insidious poison is turning these pristine waters a murky green, choking them with noxious algae and threatening their very existence. This is the story of Florida's water crisis and how the state is grappling with the consequences of its own success. To understand why Florida's springs are in trouble, you first have to understand where they come from. It all starts deep underground in the Floridan aquifer. This isn't just some underground river, it's a colossal subterranean reservoir of fresh water, one of the most productive in the world. It sprawls across 100,000 square miles and provides drinking water for about 90% of Floridians. The water that bubbles up in the springs is a direct window into the health of this massive aquifer. Now, the very geology that creates these beautiful springs also makes them incredibly vulnerable. Most of Florida sits on a bed of limestone. Over millions of years, naturally acidic rainwater has dissolved this rock, creating a landscape called karst topography. Think of the ground beneath Florida as a giant piece of Swiss cheese, riddled with sinkholes, caves, and interconnected tunnels. This Swiss cheese geology is great for storing and moving huge amounts of water, which is why the springs exist. But it's also a superhighway for pollution. Anything that spills on the surface, fertilizers, pesticides, waste, can travel directly into the aquifer with almost no natural filtration. What happens on the land in Florida does not stay on the land. It goes directly into the water and straight to the heart of the springs. The threat isn't a single chemical, but a pervasive cocktail of contaminants. The number one enemy, the most destructive ingredient in this poison cocktail, is nitrate. Nitrate is a form of nitrogen, and in the water, it's invisible, tasteless, and odorless. The EPA's drinking water limit for nitrate is 10 milligrams per liter. But for a spring ecosystem to be considered healthy, Florida's own Department of Environmental Protection, the FDEP, sets a much lower threshold, just 0.35 milligrams per liter. Here's the shocking part. Approximately 80% of Florida's major springs fail this test. Their nitrate levels are not just a little high, they are often 20 to 100 times higher than what would be found in a natural, unpolluted spring. This isn't a natural occurrence. It's the direct result of human activity over the last 50 years. So where is it all coming from? Let's break it down. The biggest source, by a long shot, is agriculture. A staggering 70% of the nitrates polluting Florida's most important springs comes from agricultural runoff. This includes the nitrogen-rich fertilizers spread on crops and the immense amount of animal waste from livestock operations like dairy and poultry farms. In regions like the Suwannee River Basin, which is famous for its springs, scientists have drawn a direct line from increased fertilizer use since the 1960s to the rising nitrate levels in the water today. The second major source, accounting for about 17% of the nitrates, is human waste. Florida has over 2.6 million septic systems. Many of these are old, and they are often installed in sandy, porous soil with a high water table, basically the worst possible conditions for treating waste. A standard septic system only removes about 30 to 40% of the nitrogen from wastewater. The rest seeps directly into the groundwater. For example, in the area around Weeki Wachee Spring, it's estimated that septic systems dump over 280,000 pounds of nitrogen into the groundwater every single year. The remaining 12% comes from what's called urban fertilizer. This is the fertilizer used on residential lawns, golf courses, and landscaping. As Florida cities have sprawled, so has the quest for the perfect green lawn, often leading to excessive fertilizer use that washes right into the aquifer. This flood of nitrates acts like a steroid for algae. The ecological chain reaction it triggers is called eutrophication, which is just a scientific term for nutrient over-enrichment. This process fuels the explosive growth of the wrong kind of algae. We're not talking about the good algae that form the base of a healthy food web. We're talking about thick, disgusting, filamentous mats of algae that turn the once clear water into a murky, green soup. These harmful algal blooms do more than just ruin the view. As these dense mats of algae spread, they block sunlight from reaching the native aquatic plants below, like eelgrass. This is a huge problem because eelgrass is a critical food source and habitat for manatees, turtles, and fish. The algae literally smothers the life out of the spring. And it gets worse. When all that algae eventually dies and decomposes, the bacteria that break it down consume massive amounts of dissolved oxygen in the water. This creates dead zones where fish and other aquatic animals literally cannot breathe and suffocate. Some of these algal blooms are dominated by species of cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae, which can produce powerful toxins. These toxins can be harmful and in some cases fatal to wildlife, pets, and even people who come into contact with the contaminated water. They're linked to everything from skin irritation and respiratory problems to severe liver and neurological damage. While nitrates are the main villain, they're not working alone. Urban and agricultural runoff also carries a host of other pollutants into the aquifer. Leaky septic systems and animal waste contribute fecal coliform bacteria and other pathogens. Urban runoff can contain heavy metals like lead and mercury from cars and industry. And then there are pesticides, herbicides, and even microplastics from our modern lives, all washing into the same vulnerable water supply. This decline didn't happen overnight. It's the result of decades of unchecked growth. After World War II, Florida's population boomed. This brought a massive increase in both development and agriculture. In the 1950s and 60s, the use of nitrogen fertilizers skyrocketed, and scientists can directly correlate this with the rising nitrate levels they began documenting in the 70s. By the 80s and 90s, as the population continued to soar, the problem intensified. More houses meant more septic tanks and more fertilized lawns. In the 2000s, the consequences became impossible to ignore, as once vibrant springs were now visibly choked with algae. A 2020 assessment found that over 75% of the most frequently monitored springs had nitrate levels well above the state's own recommended limit for a healthy ecosystem. The story is clear. As Florida grew, its springs suffered. The very industries that fueled the state's economic engine have been slowly poisoning its most precious natural resource. And this isn't just an environmental tragedy, it's a huge economic blow. For many communities in Central and North Florida, the springs are the lifeblood of their local economies. A 2014 study found that visitors to the springs in just the lower Suwannee and Santa Fe river basins generated $94 million in annual revenue and supported over 100 jobs. But as the water quality declines, the tourists stop coming. Studies show a direct link between harmful algal blooms and massive losses in tourism. One study on a 2018 red tide event, which is another type of harmful algal bloom common in Florida, estimated it caused a staggering $2.7 billion in losses to tourism-related businesses. Clean water is also directly tied to property values. A 2020 study found that homes on cleaner water bodies in Florida had significantly higher property values. The message couldn't be clearer. Clean water is a priceless economic asset, and letting it degrade comes with a very real price tag. Beyond the dollars and cents, there's the loss of a cultural heritage. For generations, these natural swimming holes have been cherished places for recreation and connecting with nature. As more springs become too polluted for swimming, a vital part of Florida's identity is being erased. So, who is supposed to be protecting these springs? The responsibility is spread across a complex web of agencies. At the top, you have the Federal Clean Water Act. But the real power lies with the state, primarily the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, or FDEP. The FDEP sets water quality standards and is supposed to create restoration plans. Working under them are 5 regional water management districts that handle permits and local projects. In 2016, faced with a growing crisis, the Florida legislature passed the Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act. This was a landmark law designed to protect 30 of the state's most important springs. The core of this act was the creation of Basin Management Action Plans, or BMAPs. A BMAP is essentially a pollution diet for a spring. It's a detailed plan to reduce pollutants and restore the spring's health within a 20-year time frame. The law seemed promising. It was supposed to identify all the pollution sources and assign specific reduction targets to each one, from farms to septic tanks. It even included provisions to prohibit new, high-polluting activities near the springs. But here's where the story gets frustrating. Despite the promise of this law, many advocates argue it has been a massive failure. The BMAPs, those so-called pollution diets, have been plagued by legal challenges and are seen by critics as fundamentally flawed. A major issue is that the FDEP failed to assign specific pollution reduction targets to individual sources, which was a key requirement of the law. In 2023, a court actually ruled against the FDEP on this point, but progress has been slow. Critics also argue that the plans don't do nearly enough to address the single largest source of pollution, agriculture. Instead of mandatory verifiable cuts, the plans rely heavily on voluntary best management practices for farmers, which often lack enforcement. To make matters worse, the state has continued to issue permits for massive water withdrawals from the aquifer, even in areas where springs are already suffering from reduced flows. This has led to accusations that the state is consistently prioritizing the short-term interests of industry and agriculture over the long-term health of its natural resources. But the story isn't all doom and gloom. While the regulatory system may be struggling, there is a dedicated and growing movement of citizens, scientists, and non-profit organizations fighting to save the springs. Groups like the Florida Springs Council and Earth Justice are constantly in legal battles, acting as watchdogs to force the state to enforce its own environmental laws. They are the voice for the springs in the halls of government and the courts. Then you have scientific groups like the Howard T. Odom Florida Springs Institute, which is dedicated to studying the springs, gathering the data, and educating the public. Their research provides the scientific backbone for any effective conservation strategy, and this fight is yielding some real, tangible results. At Weeki Wachee Springs, the Southwest Florida Water Management District completed a major restoration project. They removed tons of accumulated sediment and invasive algae and replanted native vegetation, giving the spring a chance to breathe again. Similarly, a restoration project at Chassahowitzka Springs successfully removed an estimated 600 pounds of nitrogen and 500 pounds of phosphorus from the spring system. These projects are localized, but they prove that restoration is possible. With targeted effort and funding, these ecosystems can begin to heal. And this is where every single one of us comes in. Protecting Florida springs isn't just a job for the government or nonprofits. Individuals can play a huge role. If you live in Florida, or even just visit, you can make a difference. Reduce or eliminate fertilizer use on your lawn. Opt for native, Florida-friendly landscaping that requires less water and fewer chemicals. If you have a septic system, make sure it's inspected and maintained regularly. Conserve water in your home to reduce the strain on the aquifer. And most importantly, get involved. Support the work of springs advocacy groups. Volunteer for a cleanup or restoration project. Contact your elected officials and demand stronger protections for our water. Florida's natural springs are at a crossroads. The science is undeniable. The constant flow of nutrients is killing them. The legal tools to protect them exist, but they have been weakened by a lack of political will and enforcement. Restoring these bowls of liquid light to their former glory will require a fundamental shift. It will require holding polluters accountable and investing in a more sustainable way of life. The crystal clear water of Florida's springs is a reflection of the state's soul. If we allow that reflection to become murky and lifeless, we lose more than just a beautiful resource. We lose a core part of what makes Florida, Florida. The fight to save the springs is truly a fight for the heart of the Sunshine State. Thanks for tuning in to G Fun Facts Online.